Welcome into an all-new episode of Her Playbook, a podcast highlighting inspiring women around the world of sport and business. My name is Madelyn Burke, and joining me this week, I'm very excited to welcome Emily Tisch Sussman. She is a creator and host of the award-winning podcast She Pivots, a Tony-nominated producer, a Marie Claire contributor, Democratic political strategist, co-owner of Gotham FC, mother of three. What can't you do, Emily?
Anything in football.
So, we all have our limits. We all have our limits.
Exactly. We need to know where we're strong and where we're not.
Exactly.
You know?
I mean, reading off like your resume and your accomplishments is so inspiring. You have done so much over the course of your career. But I want to start by going to where it all started. You started working in D.C. right out of college, working with Democratic political candidates. That is such, an intimidating field for some people to get into. How did you find your way into politics?
Well, it came in actually out of a lot of self-doubt. I really had not done particularly well in school. I felt like I had all of this energy towards fixing things I saw that were in the world. But because I had never really done well in school, I didn't think I was very smart. So I didn't think there were a lot of options that were open for me. Yeah. And I went to go work on the nearest presidential campaign that I could, the nearest swing state on a presidential campaign that I could possibly come up with, which ended up being Pennsylvania. And actually part of the reason that I chose the closest state was because my grandfather, who was still the owner of the Giants at the time, had just been diagnosed with a brain tumor. So I wanted to make sure that I was close to home and I was accessible. But going on to that campaign, something clicked for me. Mm-hmm. I was like, I'm really good at this. Like, these were things that I didn't think were skills. Like, these were things that they weren't in school. And all of a sudden I was thriving in my job. I could run a team. I could run complicated logistics. I was great for morale. People listened to me. Like, none of those things had actually been taught in school. Yeah. And so I didn't think that they were skills. But suddenly I was thriving in this job.
Right.
So we lost that campaign, and then I had to start over and think about, well, now what do I do? Right. So I went to law school, but it was only because I had that experience of working on the campaign. Like, before that, I had always thought, the lawyers were the ones who make all the big decisions. They're the smart ones. They're the big ones in the room. But I could never be that. I'm not smart enough to be that. But because I'd had this experience, it gave me the confidence to do it. So I applied to law school right away. I started right away. And after I finished law school, I went straight back to work on a presidential campaign, because if you track every 4 years, I've now done 3 years of law school plus the campaign. And I went back to Pennsylvania. And so I worked on Barack Obama's campaign, his 2008 campaign. I moved to Pittsburgh and Erie. And again, like, it just really clicked for me. Yeah. When he won, I went to Washington and I ended up working on federal military policy, which was just a totally new space for me. But I was able to combine the passion that I had felt when I had felt like I didn't know how to apply it with the skills that I had learned in law school, in advocacy. And that began my political career in Washington.
Yeah, and that's such an interesting thing too, because I mean, you grew up in such a creative space. You know, you were a theater kid, you were very like creative, artsy, and then going into something that seems so opposite that from a like observer from afar, and bringing that energy into that space and finding that, like, how did you find the courage to say, okay, I'm going to step into this fully?
It was intimidating, for sure. The way that I got to that job in specific is that my law degree, I have specialties in constitutional law and in family and matrimonial law, right. Specifically because I had been trying to understand LGBT family law. At the time, there was not a lot of case law around it. And so I was trying to look at white space. And even the reason I got to that is because when I was in law school, I was always trying to think about, what is my role? Like, where do I add value? What is the thing that I am uniquely good at? And the more I did that kind of self-exploration, I realized the thing that I'm good at is looking at a big white space and creating structure and creating steps around it. So at the time, LGBT family law was a big white space. The last piece of work that I did in law school was around how different militaries around the world had integrated to having open service. Uh-huh. And so I ended up going to the only nonprofit that was serving, so this was under Don't Ask, Don't Tell, so service members were serving in silence. And I ended up going to the only nonprofit that was representing them as their actual legal counsel. And then I worked on the policy side to help repeal Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and that is what we ultimately did when we were there.
That's incredible. And it's incredible, impactful work. And, you know, one of the things that I really found interesting in hearing you talk about this in previous interviews and such is that, you know, when you are doing policy reform, it's such a slow process and it takes a lot of time and a lot of patience, which is something that I don't know about you, I don't have. Like, I'm like, oh, this is what I want to do. This is what I want to accomplish. Let's get it done. And finding the patience to go through the entire process, but then also when things hit, they snowball. How would you describe that?
That is the biggest, like it's slow, slow, slow. I mean, not just slow for a little, slow for years, like maybe for decades it's slow. So in some ways, I think I was the right person to hit at the right time. Like I came in young, I came in fresh, I came in full of energy and full of ideas. And I was working with all people that had served full military careers. So they were in their 50s, 60s, like they had been at this for a long time. And I was able to step in and build upon all of the work that they had done this entire time. And, you know, for me to be able to reflect on that and say, yes, I was so humbled to be able to work with them and to be able to build on everything they'd done, but also know that it was me that came in with new ideas and new energy to build on it. And I think that's how I kind of found that right hitting at the right time.
It's almost like, too, with any space, you have to bring in the authentic version of yourself to add value to it, rather than saying, okay, this is what has been done here before. This is what, how other people have approached it. And it seems like what I've observed from people and what I've observed from you as well is like bringing in the authentic version of yourself to these spaces has really been what has been the catalyst for the impact you've had.
I think that's definitely true, but I also think it's because I was able to build not just on what others have done, but because I went through many years of building myself. Right, like when I was in law school, I wasn't showing up as like an interesting theater kid. Like I was showing up as a law student. Like I was just learning law. You know, like when I was working on military policy, I was at the Pentagon every week meeting with the Policy Planning Commission. And I wasn't necessarily showing up as myself. I was showing up as the representative of these service members who were serving in silence. Right? So I was going in and definitely learning as I went. And I think a big piece for me is that I always say yes. Yeah. Like in every meeting that we're sitting in and people are saying, oh, wouldn't it be good if someone did this and someone did this? And I was like, well, I'll be the one that do that. Yeah. And that actually struck me really quickly how much gets dropped. I think it's true in not just in policy, but like in every space. People love to brainstorm, but they don't necessarily love to own it. Yeah. And that actually gave me a lot of responsibility in the workplace really quickly because I was owning projects really quickly. And then I was able to move up because I was the one that owned it and really understood it. Yeah. But
also able to create layers to who Emily is, right? Not just the theater kid, not just the lawyer, not just the policy advocate, but all of these things compounded to create the whole. And you made a name for yourself in DC and had been one of the top people in this space for a decade. And then plot twist, motherhood happens. And that changed everything. And I love this. You wrote an article called My Children Killed My Career. And a lot of people just took the first part of that and said, what? But I love the full title. My children killed my career, but took me in an unexpected new direction. And that is something that I think so many women in, any professional space feel and sometimes fear or encounter when they do go through that change in their life. How would you describe, having experienced it, being a mother of three and three kids very quickly, how much that changed your professional career?
Well, first of all, I wasn't sold on having kids in the first place. Yeah. So it wasn't like I went into this grand idea that I was so excited to be pregnant. I was so excited to have kids. Like I actually wasn't really. I really loved working and I was good at it. So I didn't see why I should change that in any way. But I was very unprepared for how much I would change, even from the minute I got pregnant, because I was pretty sick from as soon as I got pregnant. So I thought I was so tough, and I was so tough in a business setting, and I was so tough in my job that I could barrel through anything. And I think at that point, that was kind of like the height of like the boss bitch. Mm-hmm. So, everyone's like running around carrying their babies. And I was like, oh, that'll be me. I'll just like carry them around and like, breastfeed everywhere, I guess. I don't know. But it really took a very significant physical toll on me being pregnant and then having a kid. And I hadn't seen examples of that. Right. So I felt like it was me. Like there was something that was wrong with me. It was very hard for me to keep up the very fast pace of my job once I had my first kid. And then I got pregnant when he was 8 months. So I was basically just pregnant again. Right. I had 2 kids in 18 months. And at that point, it became actually truly impossible for me to keep up the pace of my job. So I stepped away, not because I wanted to. Like even when I went to go tell my boss that I was leaving, she was like, oh, is it to spend more time with your kids? And I was like, absolutely not. That is so embarrassing. I would never be that person. It was because I knew that I couldn't show up to my job in the way that I had before.
Yeah.
I was crushed by the pace. And I was also very self-conscious about the fact that everybody that I worked with knew me as the person without kids. So they had an expectation of how I would work, and I also had an expectation of how I would work.
Yeah.
And I didn't think it was physically possible for me anymore. So I felt like I had to change it. So at that point, I left the think tank. I started doing my own political consulting, and then was pregnant again, going into a presidential election. And then 3 weeks later, a global lockdown with the global pandemic. So that really, truly killed my career. Because when you are in a lockdown, what you don't have is childcare.
Right. Yeah.
So I had a 2-year-old, 3-year-old, and 3-week-old, and I was trying to figure out how I could put enough work together to pitch myself to be working in a presidential election. And I couldn't do it. Yeah. I absolutely couldn't do it. And it was crushing to me because my whole identity was tied to being really good at politics. And when that evaporated, I didn't know who I was anymore.
Yeah. Well, and you talk about the example too. We see these examples of women who are like, oh, you can have it all, you can do it all, you can do it all. But I have so much respect for the fact that you say out loud the thing that so many people think and are afraid to say of like, this is scary. Changes my identity. And I think for a lot of people, whether it's, motherhood or a career change or layoffs or what have you, so many people tie their identities to their careers and then are forced for one circumstance or another to find a way to redefine it. What was that process like for you?
It was really dark. I can't pretend that it wasn't. It was very dark. I really didn't know who I was. I did not enjoy being with my children. And I couldn't hang on to anything that made me feel good, which was essentially working. None of it was available to me. Mm-hmm. So I started thinking about, how do I get advice? How do I get the advice that I need? And how do I get advice from the people that I really admire? And the thing that was so important to me about getting advice is that I needed to hear exactly what you just described. I needed it to be I didn't want just another mommy conversation. None of those mommy blogs were speaking to me in any way.
Yeah.
They were all about choosing, and I didn't choose.
Yeah.
So I really needed to hear stories of women who had gone through something that had been outside of themselves, something that had forced them out. Mm-hmm. And I needed it to be different kinds of stories. I didn't want to hear the same thing similar to me. I think because then I would just keep comparing myself to them and feeling like I couldn't match up to the way that they had done it. So this is the impetus for how I started She Pivots, because I thought, well, how do you get your idols to answer questions for you? Mm-hmm. Put it on a podcast. They'll show up, it turns out.
Yeah.
And so I just started, asking as many women who I really admired as I could. And I built on what I knew. I had a small political podcast before that, so I kind of knew how to structure it. Mm-hmm. I went to political people that I had worked with because I had thought I had a better chance of them saying yes to me, right? Because I had good credibility with them. And then, once I got Hillary Clinton, once I got Vice President Harris, that led to bigger bookings. Mm-hmm. So, I started where I already had connections and built from there.
Yeah. And I think it's one of those things too, that representation of the fact that we all go through these big catalysts and these big changes, and, looking at the wide variety of women that you have interviewed on your award-winning podcast, the common thread is that there's some sort of thing that happens, and it's not often a choice. And it's how you navigate these unexpected plot twists and pivots in life. And, is there a common thread in what you've seen about the women that you admire, that you've interviewed, and how they've handled it?
Yeah, and not all of them are famous, by the way.
Right.
Some of them are famous. Some of them we just, we happen upon their stories either because I know them and so I've heard this out of them. Mm-hmm. And now we get really incredible pitches. So I love being able to see that there are these common threads. I'd say the biggest common thread that we see is that if something is going to really change your perspective, to really change your life, it's pretty big.
Yeah.
It's not small. It is. It's a big thing.
Yeah.
And when the women were in it, when they were in that big thing, whatever it was, maybe it was motherhood, maybe it was the death of a parent, maybe it was being laid off, it could be so many things. They didn't necessarily know they were going to make it out. Mm-hmm. And I think that's so important for us to talk about in every one of these conversations, to really dig deep into that moment. Sometimes I feel guilty that I'm asking these guests to relive the hardest thing they've ever gone through in a lot of detail, but I think it's important. I think that's where I learned from it. I think that's where our listeners learn from it. To hear that you weren't presupposed to success.
Yeah.
It's so easy to see these success stories and be like, oh, they did this, then this, then this. And so of course they made it big. they didn't know they were going to be successful at every step along the way. And I think that's really important for people to hear.
Yeah. And having those moments of being faced with, oh no, this might be the end of the road. And then being able to say, how am I going to find my way out of it is probably the most relatable story arc for anyone.
And by the way, it might be the end of the road.
Right.
Like the thing might not always be that I can come back to what I did before. Mm-hmm. In fact, it's probably not.
Yeah.
This situation might no longer be there. And also, you are different.
Yeah.
Not just that you've lost something, in my case, it was my bandwidth.
Yeah.
But also that you've gained something. Like you've gained new perspective. I'd actually say that I've gained new bandwidth because I manage my time differently now. I can sure multitask with the best of them on another level. Like I've gained a lot too. So I actually think, to go back to your question about, what, not just did my kids kill my career, which they did, but they opened a new pathway for me. If I were, of course, I still get jealous. Like I still get jealous of people that are still in politics, having the jobs that I never got to have. I totally do. And I think about it all the time. And I have opportunities I never could have had if I was still in it. I never could have interviewed the first female sitting vice president of the United States. Mm-hmm. I couldn't have been here with you today. I couldn't have been talking about all of this. Like I couldn't be as open about what my children have brought into my life in a positive way.
Right.
I couldn't do any of that if I was still working in politics.
Yeah, and I see you've got a necklace with the names of your kids on it, and that there's a lot of positive coming from that as well. That's really precious too. And it's one of those things that, you look at it, it's like you lose one part of yourself, but you gain another. And it's, mourning that one part of yourself is a really valid and relatable experience.
So valid.
Yeah.
Like we need to give ourselves space for that. And we need to give ourselves time to say, it's okay. Like things are different and you're allowed to be sad about it.
Yeah.
You don't have to just by the end of the article, snap up and say,
happy ending.
Happy ending. Like now I found my happy ending. Like, of course it's going to be a process. And I'm still evaluating all the time.
Yeah.
Like I'm going through that process of reevaluating how I spend my time and how I prioritize constantly.
Yeah.
I'd say I really step back and look at it pretty much every week. Mm-hmm. Like I look back and say, how am I spending my time this week? Am I spending my time, my precious time and bandwidth, which is the most precious thing that I have, on the things that really matter to me? Mm-hmm. And sometimes the thing that matter to me are helping me grow my show, helping book other guests. Sometimes the things are, if my kids are struggling, it's spending more time with them. But I really do an evaluation pretty much every week to kind of change my priorities and make sure I'm spending my time to reflect it.
Yeah, it's like we're all juggling myriad things at any given moment, but we just have to decide which of those balls are the glass balls that we cannot drop and which ones are the plastic ones that if they hit the ground, then it's okay, that, life keeps going. And it's a balancing act for sure. And I mean, you pivoted to a new version of yourself in many ways. One of the things, when people meet Emily, one of the first things you'll notice, if you're not watching the video version of it, is your signature purple hair, which I love. It's this lavender flow. And it's not something you did until after you left DC. And now I feel like it's one of those things that it's a trademark for you. The She Pivots podcast logo has it, and all that kind of stuff. What went into that decision?
I never could have had this hair in Washington.
Exactly.
Never. So we left Washington right before the pandemic just because we were kind of ready to go and ready to be closer to family.
Yeah.
But then it was actually when I had COVID, during the lockdown, and it was just a really bleak time.
Yeah.
And I felt like, oh my God, I have to do something to come out of this. It just makes me, just anything that brings me joy. Is it a walk outside by myself that brings me joy? Is it anything? And when I was younger, I had brightly colored hair, but I had been so intentional going into Washington and going into policy to be like, this is serious, Emily. This is lawyer, Emily. That I really was pretty concerned with conforming. And I actually don't think that was wrong. I think I did have to conform to be able to be successful in that space.
Yeah.
But so after I had COVID, I said to my hairdresser, I was like, make me purple. I just need to do something that brings me joy. I can't dance all night long. I can't see other people yet. I just want to look in the mirror and feel joy.
Yeah.
And it has just gotten consistently more and more purple. And now it is here to stay.
I love it. And it's a trademark. It's a defining factor. And it is such a joyful thing. And, one of the many things that comes from this evolution of this new pivot of yours, when you look at when you first found that whisper of okay, this is a podcast I want to start. This is a conversation of what I want to start. Because this is something I think a lot of people in this experience feel too. It's okay, this is the end of this road, but I feel kind of pulled in this direction. how did you know that that's the one to trust? How did you know that, yes, this is the right one for me?
I didn't.
Yeah.
I didn't know. Like, I just had to try a lot of things and see how they felt. I mean, and there are so many messy pieces along the way. Like, I kept the political podcast going for a couple of months because it was the only thing that felt work related to me. And so it was the one place that I felt like I had my outlet. And then I ended up at the beginnings of a lawsuit with my old production company. And so for the last months of my political podcast, I was doing all of the shows on Instagram Live and pulling the audio feed off of it.
Yeah.
And I couldn't even upload them to my feed because they controlled it. Like, there were so many messy pieces along the way. I'm a person that just, I'm stealing a phrase from my friend Sally Christensen, who makes these beautiful Argent suits.
Love it.
But she taught me this phrase that I think about all the time now, that I have a bias towards action. And I think that's actually really helped me in a lot of ways. That I don't have anxiety stopping me from just trying something.
Yeah.
And I think even if you do, you can start small. But like, just kind of dip your toe and say, like, does this feel good? Does this feel like something that I should do? And even She Pivots as a podcast changed in so many different forms from when I had this, it wasn't even an idea. It was like a pleading to the universe, like, please, somebody give me advice. It had so many different forms from what it started as to what it is now. I mean, I thought it would be an award show. I thought I would sell it to a media company. I didn't even know if I would host it because I had so many physical problems from having 3 kids in 3 years. Like, I could have never envisioned what it is right now.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's grown so much. It's an award-winning podcast. It's sponsored and it's had so many incredible guests as well. But, you mentioned the bandwidth too. It's not all that you're doing. You have so much on your plate. It is so inspiring. One of the things too is being involved as a co-owner of Gotham FC, the women's soccer team here in New Jersey. And we talk about this a lot, but women's sports are growing so exponentially. And, you've been on the forefront of policy change in DC and now watching culture change almost in the sport world. They're not unrelated, right? You have to change a culture to change a policy, and changing the culture and putting all these eyes on women's sports and watching it grow. How rewarding is that?
Beyond rewarding. It really is so rewarding. The athletes are so strong and dedicated, and they're exactly the kind of people that you want them to be. They lead with strength. They lead with camaraderie. They love each other. They support each other. Allie Krieger, the captain at the end of last season when we won the national championship, she always says this. She said, every player on that team had a role. If they were on the pitch, if they were on the sidelines, if they were in the locker room, every player had as much of a role. And that has been just incredibly inspiring to be around. We just came in as co-owners this year, and I just want to do right by them. I want to do for them on the business side and the marketing side and the culture side what they have already done on the soccer side. They've done it, and that is our job. It's my sister, Carolyn, that leads our investment. She leads the work with the team, and that's actually been great as well for me to work with my sister for the first time.
Yeah.
I wasn't supposed to be part of this functionally at all. This was just, Carolyn has the sports background. She has the business background. But just, I want to do right by these players and they fans, and they deserve so much. So I just pitch in wherever I can.
Yeah. And it's got to be interesting too, because your family, the Tisch family, also has been a large part of the ownership of the Giants for several decades. And having that kind of experience within the family tree, has that been helpful or eye-opening as you pursue this new path?
Really interesting. The Giants are they're a part of me. They're a part of my childhood. They're a part of my family. My grandfather bought 50% of the team when I was about 9 years old. And so every Sunday was dedicated to the Giants. I did not play sports. I was not athletic. And at first, I'm not sure I understood the rules, but I knew that I cared about spending that time with my grandparents. So even in the old stadium, in the old Giant stadium, we had a really thin little box with a really thin little staircase, and my grandfather wouldn't let us take seats. So we had to sit in the stairs next to him. But that was important to us. And every week after the game, we would go out to dinner with my grandparents. And then we kept that going in the off season. I actually have, I don't know that I can actually get to it. We're gonna try this. We're gonna move around this. We're gonna
I love it.
Production a little nervous right now.
All right, I'm here for it.
When my grandfather passed away, I got a tattoo.
Okay.
Ready?
Oh, let's see it. Ugh. Oh!
Can you see it?
PRT.
Yeah. But it's the tattoo is my grandfather's initials and a Giants logo.
Giants logo.
Because it was just such an I was so close to my grandparents, and it was such an incredible, and in fact, I wear my grandmother's rings.
Oh.
It was just, it was so incredibly important to me with my relationship with my grandparents, with my mom, with my sister, with my family, and part of our family tradition.
Yeah.
So to think about how, now my kids are so into it. My kids love it. My sister's kids love it. But to think about how we can be at the beginning stages to build that for a women's team, for any team, but I think particularly for a women's team, is such an honor. Like, it's such an incredible opportunity. And to think about the fact that we're now building this tradition for our kids, like, yes, for our daughters, but we're building it for our sons too.
Sure.
Like, our sons don't know that they should be surprised that there's all this fanfare for women's sports.
Exactly.
And that's incredible. Like, let's keep it that way. Like, my son knows more players on Gotham by name, I think, maybe at this point than the roster and the Giants, I'm sorry to say. But he knows some, and we drive around, we keep a box of Gotham merch in the trunk of the car. So we like hand it out to people as we're going around. And my son said to me the other day, he was like, but what if they have another women's soccer team they like? And I was like, well, let that be our problem.
There we go.
You know?
It's a good problem to have, right?
That would be a great problem to have.
I love that perspective, though. It's like, this is a young generation that is growing up in a time that they don't know that it should be surprising that there's so much fanfare around women's sports, that they don't know that it should be surprising that the women's Final Four and championship game outrated the men's, that they think that this is, of course it is great to celebrate women and their accomplishments at the highest level. And that's just kind of going to continue to evolve and change as this all grows.
Yeah, I do think it's important that our girls have these really incredible athletic mentors.
Yeah.
But it really is for our boys too. Mm-hmm. And I'm very specific when I talk with my kids. Like, my kids work out with me and I say that, I'm strong. Like, sometimes they'll say that my husband should open something or fix something. And I'm like, I'm stronger than him. Like, I'm strong.
I can do it.
I can do that. And I think that's important. Like, it's important to talk with our kids about it. And for them to have these examples is so incredibly important. And also, just for families to have the traditions of things they can do together is really important. For our generation, it was football, basketball, baseball. But unfortunately, those have financially become out of reach for a lot of families. If you want to take a family of four to a live event, which is such an important social event for parents and families to be able to do together.
Yeah.
People can't make it to more than one game a season, if that. Like, it's just financially out of reach.
Yeah.
So the fact that we're starting this league and can build from the ground up. One of my best friends she coaches her son's boys soccer team in Montclair. She's bringing the whole league with her to the Gotham game. Because, one, she loves it.
Yeah.
She named her daughter after Rose Lavelle, actually. Oh, that was a lot. When
Love
we told
that.
Rose Lavelle, she got a little overwhelmed.
Yeah, sure. I'm sure.
But, for there to be something to take all of the boys to see a professional game together, that means a lot.
Yeah, it does. It does. Now, before we wrap this up today, I just want to leave our viewers and listeners with a piece of advice from you. And if you were to look at your younger self at the beginning of all of this journey and look back, is there something that you would wish that you knew for certain at that point?
I think the thing that I wish that I had known was that people are paying less attention to you than you think they are.
Yeah.
I was so self-conscious for a long time. It's wonderful and it's incredible growing up as a legacy as part of the Tisch family in New York and part of the Giants. But there was a lot that came with that too. I felt like if I couldn't succeed at the highest level, then I shouldn't even be trying, because I was so worried that I wouldn't be good enough to do something at the highest level. And so I think it made me very rebellious. I think that's why I kind of checked out of school until I went to law school. I was trying to define myself, and I was so concerned of what other people thought of me to make sure they knew that I was my own person. I was not just part of the Tisch family. Like, I was my own person, that I think it was detrimental to me for a very long time. And it wasn't until, even in the last few years, like really recently, I think I've become more and more comfortable in my own skin. But the thing that I was most self-conscious about was people thinking that I hadn't earned my way, and that it was just nepotism.
Yeah.
Which is, I think a big part of why I actually moved to Washington. I don't think I could have ever gained that kind of self-confidence and track record if I had stayed in New York, because my family is such a big presence here. But it wasn't until I was in Washington it took a big toll on me, making sure that I was always the hardest working in the room, working the longest hours. I mean, it took a real physical toll on me for a long time. But I was confident because I knew that I earned it. And it wasn't until I was so worried that people were still kind of whispering it about me, and I found out they still were. It was my greatest fear, and I'd worked so hard to prove myself, and they were still saying I hadn't earned it. That at that point, yes, it was crushing, but it was also kind of freeing because I was able just to say, screw them. Like, I actually don't care. I couldn't have worked harder.
Yeah.
I couldn't have had more impact. Like, there's actually nothing that anybody can say that can affect me anymore. So I would say that's just the one thing that I had I wish I had that kind of confidence earlier, but we all have to work through it.
I love it. That's a really powerful perspective, and I respect it. Emily Tisch Sussman, thank you so much for taking the time on Her Playbook.
Thank you.